Hello everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. Tonight I wanted to take a moment to shout out the Halloween Horror Hour, a new YouTube channel streaming spooky and original content from SCC TV, or Scary TV, a local public access station right here in Seattle, Washington. So, bringing content from my hometown to yours. A mashup of horror shorts, music videos, all things Halloween, and more. Oh, and did I mention you'll catch the Darkest Hour on there too? Oh yeah. So, subscribe to the Halloween Horror Hour now and be one of the first to witness the spooky. Now, let's get started, shall we? My Aunt Jo is the coolest person I know. She loves to collect anything strange and unusual, and her creepy dolls are the heart of that collection. Some are from her childhood, most are gifts accumulated over the years, and the rest came from eBay or secondhand shops. Those are the creepiest. Especially her favorite. It may have started out as an actual Miss Piggy doll, or it could have just been a random animatronic pig, but we call her Miss Piggy anyway. You know how dolls from the 70s have that weird, stiff-looking material? It's like that. Its pink skin is faded and stained. There's a large bald patch on its head, and what's left of its curly blonde hair is now brown and frizzed out. It's wearing green flower print overalls with a stained yellow shirt and sneakers. On the bottom of the right shoe, someone wrote, "Bye-bye," in a thick black Sharpie. And the left says, "Piggy Pie." Another weird thing is that the ink has never faded. Aunt Jo has had the doll for at least 20 years, but the words look like they could have been written yesterday. Dad teases that she just colors them in herself. But Mom remembers helping Aunt Jo unpack her storage shed when she finished college. She was the one who pulled Miss Piggy out of the box, and she swears the ink almost looked wet. It freaked them both out. My aunt just so happens to enjoy being freaked out. My mom, not so much. It genuinely bothers her to talk about this, and she refuses to be in the same room as the doll. So, I truly believe she's telling the truth. Several people have had weird experiences with Miss Piggy. Most of them were small things, like her eyes would suddenly look in their direction, or one of her limbs would move. And months, sometimes years, might pass between occurrences. But the freakiest thing of all happened last October while I was staying with Aunt Jo. Dad had business in New York, and Mom had wanted to see the city, so they made a little getaway of it. Her house has been completely redone since this, but on my third night with Aunt Jo, we watched some random scary movies before bed. The couch we sat on was directly across from the TV, which sat in the middle of a huge entertainment center, with shelves on 3 sides and cabinets across the bottom. Miss Piggy sat on the shelves to the right, closest to the wall with the patio doors. The blinds were open so Jo could see when her cat was ready to come inside, but until he triggered the motion lights, the glass panes essentially acted as mirrors. At one point, some kind of projectile hit the floor. It sounded like a giant June bug flew into it at full speed. Aunt Jo and I reflexively turned to look, and at the exact same time, we both let out a startled scream as Miss Piggy's reflection very slowly turned towards us. Not thinking, we quickly looked back at the real thing to see that she was still in her original position. Only her reflection had moved. At first, we were pretty freaked out, but once the initial shock wore off, we started getting excited about what a great story we had. Don't forget, these events are usually few and far between. We had zero expectation of anything else occurring that night, let alone multiple incidents. We were about halfway into the next movie when a small glass vase sitting next to Miss Piggy suddenly toppled to the ground and shattered. There was nothing near it, and the pebbles inside would have made it too heavy for a draft to knock it over, even if there had been one. That vase had been sitting there for years with no problems, and then all of a sudden fell over on the exact night Miss Piggy was acting up. That just feels like too much of a coincidence. Especially when you factor in this last part. The movie ended about 45 minutes later, and we turned off the TV to get ready for bed. The house was completely silent as we walked across the living room, and out of nowhere, we both heard the soft giggle of a small girl. That was a first for Aunt Jo, and Miss Piggy hadn't done something new in over 10 years. It was so loud and clear, we thought the TV came back on. We both heard the exact same thing. There was just no logical explanation from where it came from. We were so freaked out that I slept with my aunt for the next 2 nights of my stay, but nothing else happened. My grandma always used to blame the sounds in her attic on a squirrel family she believed had taken up residence in her walls. The guest room I slept in used to be my mom's old room, still decked out in 80s nostalgia, untouched since my mom's graduation. After she left for college, the room was closed up like a time capsule, only to be unearthed every time my grandma would have to babysit me. The decades of dust gathered in the corners of the room. It gave it a musky smell, reminiscent of a secondhand store. I remember there were a lot of scary things about her house that I didn't like when staying there. Outside my bedroom window, there was a large oak tree. The wind would make the branches scratch up against my window. They'd create dancing shadows at nighttime. The limbs of the tree would stretch into hunched creatures if I stared at the shadow too long. I also didn't believe the noises my grandma would blame on the squirrels were actually coming from squirrels. Especially as an adult and being forced to deal with a squirrel problem in my own home. I could separate the sound of skittering from what I used to hear as a child. The skitters in my grandma's house sounded more like soft footsteps and whispers above me. But every time I'd tell her things I'd hear during the night, she was adamant that the source was coming from squirrels. I felt like my concerns had been belittled. Neither of the guardians taking care of me bothered to make my situation better. I thought, maybe it's me. If I'm the only one who's feeling this, maybe I do need to toughen up a bit. I could tell both my grandma and mom were sick of hearing me complain about the bumps in the night. I eventually kept it to myself. I'd attempt to will myself into dreamland every night, by ignoring the sounds and shadows that would move around in my room at night. One time I heard the bedroom door quietly open. I squeezed my eyes closed, but then thought it could have been my grandma checking on me. Turning to face the door, I saw that it had been slightly opened, shedding a small amount of light into the room. That's when I saw it, just out of reach from where the light stretched. A shadow grew from the ground into a tall figure. It stood there for a moment, and then it moved into the closet and slowly closed the door. The next morning, I briefly forgot about the night terrors. Then I saw that the room door and the sliding closet door were now wide open. I didn't tell my grandma, however. I was proud for acting like a big boy in a situation I assumed everyone had to deal with growing up. I got pretty good at suppressing my fear when I was there. Then, an odor I hadn't smelled before became prevalent during my visits. It would take my nostrils an hour to adjust when entering the house. They would have to readjust after I'd go outside to play, and then come back in. Flies began to huddle on the windows, not only in my room, but all over the house. Fortunately, the foul smell couldn't be ignored. It got so bad, my mom even noticed one afternoon when she was dropping me off. When she asked my grandma where the hell this wretched smell was coming from, she had a list of possibilities. Most of them involved calling an exterminator to get into the attic and check around. A week or so goes by and she's finally able to get an appointment with an exterminator. When he gets there, he's already dressed like a steampunk astronaut, ready to get into my grandma's crawl spaces. But as decked out as this guy was, even he was unprepared for what we'd soon discover was the source of the smell. Playing outside in my grandma's backyard, I hear a grown man scream in a way that I've yet to hear this day recreated. It wasn't one of those screams you run towards saying what happened. The scream made me pause and think, should I go hide somewhere? A while goes by and the sun has changed positions in the sky. It's a hot day and my grandma keeps coming out with lunch and snacks, but I'm not allowed in the house. A police car pulls into the driveway. Eating a sandwich, I stand there as a cop gets out and gives me a wave while he walks into the house. Next, an ambulance arrives at the house, and then a third car I don't recognize. My mom then pulls into the driveway a bit later. If she'd left work early to get here, this must have been something really bad. The driveway is partway in the backyard, and when she pulled in and saw me by the tree, the first thing she asked is if I'd gone inside. I said no, and then she told me to stay outside before she went in. Both of them eventually walked out behind two paramedics dressed in hazmat suits. They wheel out a zipped-up body bag on a stretcher, and they place it in the car I don't recognize. Mom tried to shield me from watching the men struggle to load the black plastic bag into the back. When I asked what was going on, I was told that when the exterminator climbed into the attic and turned on his flashlight, he found a decomposing dead body. Ironically, the smell it let off had stunk up the neighborhood enough to attract rodents and other little furries in the attic to feast on the remains. Naturally, that part was shared with me later. A more in-depth version was shared with me years later, which is when I learned a homeless man had broken into my grandma's house for an undisclosed amount of time. Then he overdosed and died. When they removed the body and climbed up to inspect the attic, there were dirty blankets, pillows, food, a small portable radio, indicating that he had been living up there for a long time. Worst of all, probably, they found a couple pairs of my underwear amongst his stuff. He died of an overdose and rotted up there, until the overpowering smell made us search. The smell of death is an odor I'll never forget, and I can instantly spot when it's in the air. It is an indescribable, heavy scent that lingers in your hair. I remember I took 1,000 showers that night, and I could still smell it on me when I got out. My husband is from Russell, Pennsylvania, and he's a big, burly mechanic that doesn't get spooked very often. But he told me a story from his childhood that he apparently never got over. Has anyone else heard of this? Deep in the woods of the Allegheny National Forest, my husband and his dad were deer hunting. My husband says that he had a buck in his sights. He's about to pull the trigger, and the buck turns its head and makes eye contact with him through the zoom, like it was aware of his intentions. My husband felt a weird sense of hesitation during this time. He says that this big buck stood up like a human. Not only that, it started walking towards his hunting spot. His dad saw it too, but pulled the trigger. It hit the deer in the chest, but didn't drop it. Instead, it got back on all fours and ran away. I have to know, has anyone else seen deer walking like humans in the Allegheny National Forest? My ex always had a very short fuse, while I'm more of a laid-back type of gal. I'm 28 now, but when I was 21, my boyfriend Jake and I were on our way to meet our weed dealer at a gas station on the other side of the city. He was at a friend's house and we didn't want to wait, so that was the best we could do. I had no clue what kind of area this place was in, and I didn't put any thought into it because it shouldn't have mattered. It was still daylight outside, and I was just going along for the ride. Over halfway there, Jake and I start arguing about some trivial thing that I can't even remember, and things were taken too far. Before I knew it, I was standing on the side of the road, watching my boyfriend's car speed away. Only when he was out of sight did I actually take a look at my surroundings and realize I might be in trouble. If I didn't want to walk along an extremely busy highway with barely a shoulder to stand on, I would have to walk down an embankment and into a frontage road which ran alongside a very unsavory neighborhood. After a big truck drove by a little too close for comfort, I walked down to the frontage road, hoping that Jake would turn around soon. I knew he'd come back for me. He always did. But I wasn't sure if it would be before or after he got the weed. Well, as it turns out, he opted for after. As I stood on the side of this frontage road, I looked down the street closest to me and saw the first house's door was covered in duct tape. There was hardly any of the door's actual surface left showing. It just felt like a bad sign, and maybe it was because the house next door had a group of 4 big men sitting on the porch, and they noticed me. One of them called for me to come over. Another asked if I needed a ride. I was terrified they would try to walk over, so I shouted, "No thanks," as I began moving away. After making it a few streets over, I looked back and didn't see them, but a white truck was coming, so I got over as far as I could to let it pass. Only it didn't pass. It stopped right next to me, and an older, toothless man began scolding me like I was a child. I looked pretty young, so he very likely thought that I was one. He spoke in a slurred but commanding tone. Whether he was drunk or just sounded that way due to a lack of teeth, I have no idea. He said it was too dangerous to walk around in that neighborhood and demanded I get into his truck. I didn't like that at all. Maybe he meant well, but in my experience, when a stranger uses fear and intimidation to scare you into action, when they won't let you think or respond, they have something bad in mind. I tried to say no thanks and walk away, but the man rode right alongside me and continued insisting I get in. That's when I looked back and saw those 4 men had followed me after all. They were standing together at the end of their street, just watching. I was in danger no matter what. If the toothless man drove off, the 4 men would be able to follow me. But if I got into that truck, there's no telling where I would end up. I knew that option was off the table no matter what. In a moment of sheer panic, I turned and darted back up the embankment towards the highway, the toothless man screaming at me all the while. Once I made it to the top, I looked back to see the white truck turning around. He went to the traffic light that would put him back on the same road as me. Meanwhile, those 4 men were now casually walking down the frontage road in my direction. I truly didn't know what to do. At that moment, it felt like the whole world was out to get me. I started walking towards the gas station while keeping as far away from the busy highway as possible, and occasionally checking on my would-be assailants. The group of men seemed like they were just following me for some kind of sick game, but they thought it was fun. They weren't in a hurry to catch up with me, but I wasn't willing to test my theory by letting them get too close. The man in the truck, on the other hand, was now on the highway, trying to weave through heavy traffic. I probably had less than a minute before he was right next to me again. That's when I saw Jake's car coming down the opposite side of the highway, and I did something incredibly impulsive and reckless. I ran straight into oncoming traffic and almost died crossing that busy highway. Horns were honked, brakes were slammed, and curses were screamed. But I miraculously made it to safety. The second I opened the car door, Jake was already screaming at me, and I just wasn't having it. For the first time in our relationship, I screamed right back. I told him the whole story of how he almost got me killed, and he said I was imagining it. And that if I'd gotten hit by a car, it would have been nobody's fault but my own. Fine, granted that part is debatable. I clearly shouldn't have taken that risk. I'm not saying I'm blameless. I'm saying that he's also partially at fault. After he took me home that night, I sent him a breakup text. I sure as hell wasn't going to do that while we were in the car. I went to the University of Utah and delivered pizza for the campus pizzeria. One night, we got an order for one small cheese pizza, and it was just me and 2 girls closing. The address was on my way home, so I volunteered to drop it off. I'll regret my moment of chivalry forever. When I arrived, the entire house was dark and so disheveled that I double-checked the address. The lawn was overgrown with bike parts and trash littered about the lawn. My first knock opened the door, and I was hit by a putrid, unmistakable smell of death. I ran back to my car to call the police. Later in the news, I learned that a woman killed herself in that house 2 weeks earlier. I'm so glad I listened to that little voice in my head. I'm glad I listened to that little voice and just called the police. If I'd stumbled across a scene like that, I'd never be able to unsee. But what still gives me the chills is who ordered the pizza. Growing up, I was raised by a single mother in a very rural area. We only had one other person living on our road, a middle-aged woman named Juniper, but I called her Auntie June. When Mom had to work nights or weekends, I'd just walk across the field and stay next door. When I was really little, Mom used to always explain June's odd behaviors by saying she was eccentric or quirky, but sometime right after my 8th birthday, I overheard her talking with my granddad. He didn't like that she let me spend so much time with that witch. He wanted to take care of me instead, before June had me worshiping the devil. Mom said that he was being ridiculous, and they argued for a few minutes, but Granddad didn't get his way. He was a grouchy, boring old man who made me sit quietly in my room all day because children weren't meant to be seen or heard. As far as he was concerned, they were only there to learn responsibility until they could become contributing members of society. I ran back to my room as he was leaving so Mom wouldn't suspect I heard anything. I wanted so badly to ask how anyone could think Auntie June was a witch, but 8-year-old me just wasn't brave enough. Especially after Mom came to ask what I usually did when I went over there. Deep down, I knew we'd done absolutely nothing wrong, but Granddad had given me doubts, so I kept things brief. I loved helping her with her herb garden. That was one of my favorite things to do, and for the longest time, I wanted to be a botanist because of it. We also baked cookies and made jewelry out of rocks, crystals, and beads while watching TV or listening to music. Sometimes she would tell me little stories. Well, I thought that they were just stories at the time. About the horned god, the triple goddess, and different things about nature. But I had a feeling Mom wouldn't like them as much as I did, so I left that part out. Of course, I would soon find out that they weren't fairy tales. They were her actual beliefs. A few nights later, Mom had to work a night shift, which meant I would finally get to ask Auntie June why Granddad thought she was a witch. There was truly nothing I wouldn't have been comfortable talking to this woman about. I ran all the way to her house, burst through the door, and there she was. Before she could even say hello, I said, Auntie, why does my pappy think you're a witch?" Ah, childhood. Fuck that shit. June had been washing dishes and I startled her. The plate she was rinsing slid from her hands back into the sink, and she turned towards me, wide-eyed and tight-lipped. My stomach dropped. I thought that I'd made the nicest woman in the world angry with me. But then she began laughing hysterically. She said people like to call her a witch because ignorant folks tend to slap that title onto any alternative religion. They're the same ones who treat paganism and Wicca like dirty words. I asked if people felt that way because those religions worship the devil, and she laughed even harder. She said it couldn't be explained so easily, that the original structure of the practice had grown and evolved to the point where many different sects now existed, and they all had varying beliefs. I was completely fascinated with all of it. I wanted to learn everything there was to know. but June said that she wasn't sure if my mom would be comfortable with her teaching me those kinds of things. I can't remember what it was, but something she said made me ask if the stories she told me were about her religion. She said that they were a mixture of stories from several belief systems, and only a few had been from her own. Of course, that made my mind run wild, trying to guess which stories, but there were just too many to choose from. I asked her if any of them really worshiped the devil, and she said that some did, but failed to elaborate further. I tried once more to ask which religion she practiced, but she said it was too complicated to put a single name to it without further explanation. Finally, I made one last attempt to clarify. But you don't worship the devil, right? She only rolled her eyes and said, "What do you think, child? Do you judge a person by what they believe or by their character?" I took it as one of those things adults said, like it's what's on the inside that counts. Before I could think it through any further, she changed the subject and we baked a batch of brownies, but I was still thinking hard over our conversation. The more I thought about it, I realized she said people called her a witch because that title went with any alternative religion. It only sounded that way because of how she said it. June didn't believe in lying. She was very serious about owning one's truth no matter what, but she wasn't opposed to phrasing things just so. Anyway, the night grew late and we settled into our respective recliners to watch Looney Tunes until we fell asleep. At least that's what we usually did. That night I made myself stay awake, and once I heard the familiar sound of her snoring, I went snooping. It occurred to me that every time any devil or occult stuff was on TV, there was always some kind of scary, evil-looking shrine. I figured if I went through every room in her house and didn't find a shrine, she couldn't be a devil worshiper. Well, I poked through every closet, and I even looked under the beds, but I didn't find anything that seemed suspicious. The next morning, my mom came to wake me up. I felt silly about the whole thing. Within a few days, I forgot about the incident entirely, and life continued as it always had, but only for 2 more years. My mom met a guy not too long after all of this happened, and they got married the following year. When I was 10, we had to move to Utah for my stepdad's new job, and I'll never forget the day I told June. I expected her to be sad, maybe even cry a little like I had, but I didn't expect complete and total fury. She was outraged. She marched right past me and over to my house like I didn't exist anymore. She didn't even knock. She just barged right through our back door and began telling off my mom. My stepdad had to practically push her out of the house, and she still wouldn't leave our property until he threatened to call the police. I hadn't been far behind her. When I got close enough to hear the yelling, I became even more frightened and hid inside one of our storage sheds. From its window, I could watch the kitchen door and wait for it to be over. Only after I was positive that she was out of sight did I make a mad dash for the house. I ran inside crying. I didn't understand why Auntie June had suddenly become so cruel. And for the longest time, I never would. All that happened almost 20 years ago, but recently, my mom called me in tears. She was damn near hysterical. She has a few friends who still live in our old hometown, and they had just informed her that June decided to take her own life. That hit me hard. Despite the strange way it ended, she'd always been a very large part of my childhood, and I still cherished my memories of our time together. As an adult, I simply reasoned that she'd become overly attached to me and couldn't stand the thought of being alone again. If anything, it was just sad. But it turns out that wasn't the shocking part of the story. The shocking part was why she did it. Apparently, I hadn't searched her house thoroughly enough because she had a fairly large shrine dedicated to Lucifer, hidden behind an access panel in her closet. The police found it during the rescue of a young girl that she had kidnapped, and June chose to die rather than face prison. I still never found out exactly what she called her religion, but thanks to her journals, I did learn why she got so upset about my moving away. It seems she was focusing her efforts on a very specific ritual, one that, if done correctly, would grant her the youth and beauty of her sacrifice. People were comparing her to Elizabeth Báthory, that crazy medieval woman who used to bathe in the blood of her servants. If you haven't heard of her, that's a wild-ass story too. I highly recommend Googling her name. But as for myself, I was clearly meant to be her first victim. For the greatest chance of success, the ritual called for the blood of someone you shared a bond with. She was grooming me. When I left, she had to start over from scratch with a new girl, but she didn't have access to any. She ended up getting a janitorial job at one of the schools and made a new friend there. Eventually, she either lost patience or felt the bond was strong enough, and she was ready to proceed. She was spotted leaving school in the middle of the day with a 13-year-old in her car. Obviously, something was wrong with that picture, no matter what their reasons were, so the police were called. The unit sent to June's home reported their location, and backup arrived shortly after. When no one answered the door, they forced their way inside and found June standing over the unconscious child with a ceremonial dagger in one hand and a silver goblet in the other. She stabbed herself through the heart with no hesitation. The girl went on to make a full recovery. She had been drugged, but no physical damage was done. If I feel this traumatized from my experience, I can't begin to imagine what that poor kid is living with. So yeah, that's my story about the time I idolized a bad witch. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode. Thanks for joining me tonight. Whether it's your first time or you're a regular, your support means the world over here, so thanks again. We've got brand new episodes every Friday night. Keep those eyes open long enough to find those deep sleep videos, and of course, double features. Subscribe, tap the bell, and you'll never miss a thing. I want to thank those who shared their stories, and a big thanks to all of you again for listening. A huge shout out to our patrons, whom we appreciate so very much. Tracy S, Tamara K, Monica L, ZoeWatt, Chelle B, Donald C, Marion T, The Dark Cosmos, Rat Girl, Alisha S, Erin G, Nikki H, Mr. Revenant, Naz K, Brendon G, Paul T, Nicholas C, Lissane, Arlene F, and Adrienne. If you want to support the Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining our Patreon. Check out patreon.com/thedarkesthour. Click the link in the description to learn more. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.